You don't look like someone who can survive out here." Caleb Whitmore's voice cut through the dust as a widow stood on his porch with nothing but a battered suitcase and a stare that refused to break. Clara Bennett didn't flinch. "And you don't look like a man who's slept in 5 years," she answered, and something in his chest cracked wide open. He only wanted a cook. He never asked for a woman who could see straight through the walls he'd spent half a decade building around a dead man's heart. Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to you, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. And in the comments tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. The advertisement was only 11 words long. Cook wanted, good pay, room provided, no personal questions. Old Jeb Caro pinned it to the board outside the trading post himself, and even as he hammered the nail in, he shook his head. "Nobody's going to take this job," he muttered. "Somebody will," Caleb said, already walking away. "Boss, the last 3 didn't last a month between them." Caleb didn't turn around. "Then find a 4th. Jeb watched him go, boots kicking up dust shoulders, set like a man carrying something heavier than any sack of grain. He'd worked for the Whitmore family for 11 years. He remembered when Caleb used to whistle while he worked the fence line. He remembered when the ranch house had windows that stayed open and music that drifted out past the barn. That house didn't breathe like that anymore. It hadn't in 5 years. Inside the bunkhouse that evening, the hands talked low over tin plates of beans and burnt bread. "Mrs. Doyle lasted 3 weeks, said Tom, the youngest of them barely 19. "She said this place feels like a grave with a roof on it." "Watch your mouth," Jeb snapped. "I'm not wrong, though." Nobody argued. Even the horses seemed to walk softer past the main house, as if they too understood there was a silence inside that shouldn't be disturbed. Caleb Whitmore owned more land than any man in 3 counties. His cattle numbered in the thousands. Bankers in Helena knew his name before he ever said it. But not one of them had ever sat across from him at supper and heard him laugh. Because he didn't. Not since Sarah. 200 miles south, in a rented room above a dry goods store in a town too small to matter, Clara Bennett folded the last of her husband's shirts into a trunk she would not be taking with her. She kept only one, the blue one. The one he wore the day he proposed to her on the back steps of her father's church, nervous as a colt, tripping over his own words until she'd laughed and kissed him, just to make him stop stammering. That man was 3 years in the ground now. Fever took him in 11 days. 11 days. And then Clara Bennett was 32 years old, with no husband, no children. A debt she hadn't caused, and a town that looked at her like she carried some kind of curse. Widow Bennett, they called her now. Not Clara, not even Mrs. Bennett. Widow. As if that word had swallowed her whole name. She'd seen the advertisement in a Montana paper a friend passed along, torn from a page and folded twice. Cook wanted, good pay, room provided, no personal questions. She read it 3 times. No personal questions. For the first time in 3 years, someone was offering her the one thing she wanted more than food or shelter. Silence about her past. She wrote back that same night before she could talk herself out of it, and 3 weeks later, she was on a stagecoach headed toward Montana territory with a suitcase, a Bible, and her mother's recipe book, its spine cracked from 20 years of use. The driver dropped her at a crossroads 2 miles from the Whitmore ranch because the road beyond it was too rutted for the coach. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked, eyeing the distant house like it was something to be wary of. "Folks in town say that place is cursed. Say the man who owns it buried his heart with his wife." Clara looked down the long dirt road. "Everybody's buried something," she said. "Doesn't mean they're finished living." She walked the 2 miles herself, suitcase banging against her leg, sweat soaking through the collar of her traveling dress, and when she finally saw the ranch house rise up out of the flat gold land, she stopped. It was enormous, and it looked utterly abandoned, despite the smoke curling from one chimney and the cattle grazing in the distance. No flowers, no curtains stirring in the windows, no sound of children or dogs or laughter drifting from the porch. Just stillness, the kind of stillness that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. She walked up the front steps and knocked twice before she heard boots on the other side. The door opened, and there he was. Caleb Whitmore was younger than she expected. Broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, with eyes the color of a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it would break. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided to reject. "You're here about the position." It wasn't a question. "I am." "You're a bit—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Smaller than I imagined." Clara set her suitcase down with a thud. "You don't look like someone who can survive out here." His eyebrows lifted, surprised at the boldness. "And you don't look like a man who's slept in 5 years. Something flickered across his face. Not anger. Something closer to shock, like she'd struck a nerve buried so deep even he'd forgotten it was tender. "Excuse me." "You heard me. I don't believe I hired you to comment on my appearance, Mrs. Bennett. Clara Bennett." "Mrs. Bennett," he said, testing the name like it tasted bitter. "I run cattle, not conversation. You cook, you clean, you keep out of my business, and I keep out of yours. That's the arrangement. If that's not acceptable, it's acceptable." He blinked, thrown by how fast she agreed. "You didn't let me finish. You said no personal questions. I'm the last person on earth who's going to ask you any." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the empty porch, rattling a loose shutter somewhere above them, and Caleb Whitmore looked at this small, sun-worn, iron-willed widow, standing on his steps like she had every right to be there. "Fine," he said finally. "Kitchen's through the back. Supper's at 6. Don't burn the house down." He turned and walked away before she could answer, and Clara stood there a moment longer, staring at the door he'd left half open behind him, wondering exactly what kind of grave she'd just agreed to live inside. She found out within the hour. The kitchen hadn't been properly used in years. Dust coated the shelves. The stove was crusted with rust along one side. A single chipped plate sat drying by the basin, evidence of a man who ate standing up alone as fast as possible so he wouldn't have to sit in the silence any longer than necessary. Clara set her suitcase in the small room off the pantry that would be hers and rolled up her sleeves before she'd even taken off her traveling bonnet. By 4 o'clock, Jeb Caro wandered in to fetch water and stopped dead in the doorway. The stove was blazing. The windows were open. The smell of frying onions and baking bread rolled out into the yard for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Lord have mercy," he muttered. Clara didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. "You must be one of the hands." "Jeb Caro, ma'am. Foreman." He took his hat off out of pure reflex. "You're the new cook." "Trying to be. Mrs. Doyle didn't last 3 weeks." "I'm not Mrs. Doyle." Jeb almost smiled. "Almost." "No, ma'am. I don't reckon you are." By 6:12, ranch hands filed into the dining hall, expecting the usual cold meat, harder bread silence broken only by the scrape of forks. Instead, they found a table. An actual table set with plates that matched steam rising off a pot roast that filled the whole room with a smell most of them hadn't tasted since they left their mother's kitchens. Tom, the youngest, stared at it like it might vanish if he blinked. "Is this a joke?" "Sit down before it gets cold," Clara said, setting the last dish in place. Nobody moved. 12 grown men hardened by years of cattle drives and harsh winters stood frozen in the doorway like boys waiting for permission. "Well," Clara put her hands on her hips, "I didn't cook this for the flies." That broke something loose. Chairs scraped. Men sat. Forks clattered against plates in a rhythm the house hadn't heard in 5 long years. Caleb entered a few minutes later, drawn by the noise, and stopped in the doorway of his own dining hall, like a stranger in someone else's home. 12 men were laughing, actually laughing over some story Tom was telling about a stubborn calf, mouths full gravy on their chins, more alive in that moment than Caleb had seen them in longer than he cared to admit. Clara stood near the stove, watching them with a small, satisfied smile, wiping her hands on her apron. Caleb's jaw tightened. "What is this?" The laughter died instantly. 12 men turned. 12 forks stopped mid-air. "Supper," Clara said simply. "This isn't supper. This is a circus. They were hungry. They eat what's put in front of them, and they eat it quietly. That's how it's always been. Maybe that's the problem. The room went dead silent. Jeb shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Tom stared hard at his plate, suddenly very interested in his potatoes. Caleb stepped further into the room, and for the first time Clara saw something dangerous flicker behind his eyes. Not cruelty, but pain, wearing cruelty's clothes. "You've been here 4 hours," he said quietly. "You don't know a thing about how this ranch runs, or what it took to build it, or what it cost." "I know a house shouldn't feel like a funeral parlor." The words landed harder than she intended. Caleb's face went pale, then tight, then unreadable, like a door slamming shut behind glass. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, voice low and controlled, in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "You were hired to cook, not to comment on how a man chooses to live in his own house after his own losses in his own way. Are we clear?" Clara held his gaze. She thought of her own husband's blue shirt, folded in a trunk 200 miles away. She thought of 11 days of fever and a town that called her cursed. "Perfectly clear," she said. He nodded once sharp and walked out without eating a single bite, boots echoing down the hallway, until a door somewhere in the house shut hard enough to rattle the windows. The hands ate the rest of their meal in careful silence. Later that night, long after the dishes were washed and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with a single candle burning low. She pulled her mother's recipe book from her bag and opened it to the first page where her mother had written in faded ink, "Feed people well, and you feed their courage too." Clara traced the words with her finger. "I don't know if I can fix him," she whispered into the dark. "I don't know if anyone can." But she thought of Tom's laughter. She thought of 12 hardened men eating like they remembered what family tasted like. "But I can feed his people," she said. "That's a start." She didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. She didn't know that Caleb Whitmore stood just beyond the kitchen door for a long moment, listening before he turned and walked away without a word. The next morning began before sunrise, the way ranch mornings always did. But something in the air felt different. Clara was already at the stove when Jeb wandered in, hat in hand, looking sheepish. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for last night. Boss ain't usually so." "He doesn't need to apologize for grieving," Clara said, not looking up from the biscuits she was cutting. "He needs to apologize for making his men afraid to be happy in his own house. Those are two very different things." Jeb stared at her. "You talk awful bold for a woman who's been here less than a day." "I've buried a husband, Mr. Caro. I don't have much patience left for men who'd rather bury themselves next to their grief than climb back out of the hole." Jeb let out a low whistle. "You're either the bravest woman I ever met or the ranch is about to lose its 4th cook in a year." "We'll see which," Clara said, and set the biscuits in the oven with a bit more force than necessary. Caleb didn't come down for breakfast. He didn't come down for the midday meal either. By supper, Clara had prepared a smaller portion, set it on a covered plate, and without a word, carried it up the stairs herself past the framed photograph of a smiling young woman that hung in the hallway, the only photograph in the entire house. She paused in front of it. Sarah Whitmore. She didn't need anyone to tell her the name. The woman in the photograph had kind eyes and an easy smile, the kind that made you feel like you'd known her your whole life after 5 minutes. "You must have been something," Clara murmured to the photograph, "to leave a man broken like this." She knocked on the closed door at the end of the hall. No answer. She knocked again. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to eat." "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning." "That's not your concern." "Everything in this house is my concern until you tell me otherwise. That was the arrangement. Wasn't it? I cook, you eat. We don't ask questions." Silence. Then the sound of a chair scraping back footsteps, and the door opened just enough for Caleb to look down at her exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He looked for just a moment less like the richest man in the county, and more like a man drowning in a house too big and too quiet for one person to survive in. "You're persistent," he said. "I'm hungry, adjacent to persistent. There's a difference. Despite himself, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. Not quite. But it was close enough that Clara noticed, and something in her chest eased just slightly, like a held breath finally released. He took the plate from her hands. "Thank you," he said, quiet, almost reluctant, like the words cost him something. "You're welcome." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Mrs. Bennet?" She turned back. "Yes. Last night. What you said about this house being a funeral parlor." Clara braced herself for anger. Instead, his voice was low, almost broken. "You're not wrong." He shut the door before she could respond, and Clara stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the photograph of Sarah Whitmore, feeling the weight of a grief that wasn't hers, pressing down on her chest anyway. 3 days passed in careful, quiet rhythm. Clara cooked. The hands ate, laughed a little louder each night. Caleb ate alone in his study, but he ate, and he began leaving the plate outside his door instead of untouched inside it. A small, silent signal that something in him was shifting. On the 4th day, a storm rolled in fast and violent, the kind Montana was famous for. Lightning splitting the sky in half and rain hammering the roof like gunfire. Clara was alone in the kitchen when the back door blew open, and she rushed to shut it, fighting the wind, when a crack of thunder so loud it shook the windows sent her stumbling backward into the counter, a hot pot of stew crashing to the floor between her feet. She cried out more from the sudden violent shock than pain, and within seconds, Caleb was in the doorway, having heard the crash from clear across the house. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, kneeling beside her on the wet floor, hands hovering over her like he didn't know if he was allowed to touch her, checking for burns, for blood, for anything. "I'm fine," she said, breathless. "Just startled. The storm. You're shaking." "I'm fine, Caleb." His name slipped out of her mouth for the first time too, and something passed between them in that small kitchen, lit only by a guttering candle and the flash of lightning through the window. Something neither of them had words for yet. Something dangerous and warm all at once. He helped her to her feet, his hand steady around hers, and for a moment neither of them let go. "You don't have to keep watching out for me," she said quietly. "That wasn't part of the arrangement." "Maybe I'm rewriting the arrangement," he said. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another sound cut through the storm, the pounding of a horse's hooves in the yard, urgent and fast, followed by frantic knocking at the front door. Caleb's hand tightened around hers for just a moment before he released it. "Stay here," he said, and disappeared down the hallway. Clara heard the front door open, heard rain and wind rush into the house, heard a man's voice, breathless and panicked, deliver words that made her blood run cold even from the kitchen. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to see this. Somebody's filed papers on your north pasture. Bank's saying there's a lien against the deed nobody's ever heard of. Your daddy's signature's on it, but the date don't make sense, sir. Somebody's been rewriting your family's land behind your back, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." Clara stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, stew still cooling in a puddle at her feet, and watched Caleb Whitmore's face go the color of ash. "That's not possible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father would never—" "There's more, sir." The writer hesitated. "The name on the new filing. It's not just the land they're after." "Then what is it?" The writer's eyes flicked just briefly toward the kitchen, toward Clara. "They're asking questions about your new cook, sir. Real specific questions, like somebody already knew she'd be here before she ever arrived." The room seemed to tilt. Clara felt the floor drop out from beneath her, the storm outside suddenly deafening her husband's blue shirt, and 11 days of fever, and a town that called her cursed all rushing back at once. Because she knew exactly what kind of trouble followed her. She just never thought it would find her all the way out here. Caleb turned slowly, his stormy eyes fixing on her from across the room, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something new behind them. Not coldness. Not grief. Suspicion. Clara, he said quietly, each word measured like a man walking on ice that had already begun to crack. Is there something you should have told me? Thunder cracked outside loud enough to rattle the windows, and Clara Bennett stood in the ruins of a spilled supper, staring at a man she'd only just begun to trust, with absolutely no idea how to answer him. The candle on the table guttered and nearly went out, and for 3 long seconds, neither of them spoke. Clara, Caleb said again, quieter this time. Is there something you should have told me? She set the spilled pot upright with hands that would not stay steady. I told you everything you asked me to tell you, she said. You said no personal questions. I didn't lie about a single thing you actually asked. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got tonight. The rider still stood dripping in the doorway, hat crushed between his hands, clearly wishing he were anywhere else on earth. Caleb didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Clara, searching her face the way a man searches a horizon for a storm he already knows is coming. Sam, Caleb said, finally not turning. Get out of the rain. Dry off in the bunkhouse. We'll talk about the filing in the morning. Yes, sir. Sam didn't need telling twice. He was gone in seconds, boots splashing back out into the storm, leaving the two of them alone with the broken pot and the thunder rattling the windows. You should sit down, Caleb said. I don't need to sit down. You're white as a bedsheet, Clara. She sat down. He pulled out the chair across from her, and for a long moment, the only sound was rain hammering the roof, and her own heartbeat slamming against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest before the truth did. My husband, she said finally, was a good man. A foolish one, but a good one. Before he died, he put money into a cattle brokerage with 2 other men in our town. One of them ran off with the investors' funds. Left my husband holding a debt that wasn't his to hold, and a reputation nobody in that town was willing to separate from mine after he was gone. That's it. That's the shame of it, yes. There's no crime in it, no theft, no lie, just bad luck and a husband too trusting for his own good, and a wife who's been called cursed and worse ever since, because folks need somebody to blame when they lose money. Caleb studied her. Then why would anyone file papers on my land the same week you arrive asking questions about you, specifically? Clara's jaw tightened. I don't know. You expect me to believe that. I expect you to believe whatever you're going to believe, Mr. Whitmore, because I've learned these last 3 years that a person's opinion of me was decided long before I ever opened my mouth to defend myself. Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. I came here because your advertisement promised no questions. I didn't come here to drag trouble onto your land. But it followed you anyway. Trouble follows everyone eventually. Yours just took longer than mine. That landed harder than she meant it to. Caleb's face shuddered the way it had the night she called his house a funeral parlor, and for a moment, she thought he might send her packing right there in the storm suitcase and all. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out into the rain-blurred dark toward the north pasture, toward land his father had ridden every single day of Caleb's boyhood. My father built this ranch with his bare hands, he said quietly. Bought that north section in '68, the year I was born. He used to say a man's signature was the only thing in this world worth more than his cattle. He turned back to her. Somebody forged that signature, Clara. Or the deed's older than anyone remembers, and somebody's counting on nobody being alive who'd know the difference. You think I had something to do with that? I think it's a mighty strange coincidence. Then investigate this coincidence, Clara said, standing now, 2 chin lifted, refusing to shrink the way she once had in front of accusing eyes back home. Ride into town tomorrow and ask every banker, every clerk, every gossiping woman at the Mercantile whether Clara Bennett has ever set foot in Montana before 3 weeks ago. You won't find a single soul who's heard my name before this month, because I've never been here. Whatever's happening to your land started long before I walked up your steps. Caleb said nothing for a long moment. I intend to, he said finally. Good. And until I know the truth, you'll keep cooking and keep sleeping in that room off the pantry and keep out of my study and I'll keep watching you a great deal closer than I have been." It should have felt like a threat. Somehow standing there in the storm-lit kitchen with her heart still hammering, it felt instead like the closest thing to fairness anyone had offered her in 3 years. "Fair enough," she said. He nodded once sharp and left her alone with the broken pot and the rain. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed off the pantry staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm finally wear itself out into a steady drizzle, and thought about the writer's words. Somebody already knew she'd be here before she ever arrived. That wasn't coincidence. That was a plan. But whose? Morning broke gray and washed clean. The yard turned to mud, and Clara was up before the sun, regardless, because grief and suspicion and thunderstorms didn't change the fact that 12 hardened men still needed breakfast. Jeb found her at the stove, dark circles under her eyes, moving like a woman running on nothing but stubbornness. "You look like you wrestled the storm yourself," he said. "Something like that. Boss rode into town at first light. Didn't say where, didn't say why." Jeb studied her carefully. "You know something about that." Clara cracked an egg into the skillet with more force than necessary. "Somebody's filed false papers on the north pasture," she said. "And somebody's been asking questions about me since before I ever left home. That's all I know, Mr. Caro, and it's already more than I understand myself." Jeb was quiet a moment. "Whitmore Land's never had trouble like that. Not once. Not in 18 years I've worked it." "Then it's a strange time for trouble to start." "Strange indeed." He watched her a moment longer, and something in his weathered face softened just slightly. "For what it's worth, ma'am, whatever's coming, the hands are behind you. You fed us like family the first night you got here. Ain't a one of us forgot that." Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you, Jeb." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me if it's still true. Come next week." He left her with that, and Clara stood over the stove, blinking back tears she refused to let fall because crying wouldn't cook breakfast, and it certainly wouldn't clear her name. Caleb didn't return until well past noon. Mud-splattered jaw set like granite, and marched straight into his study without a word to anyone. Clara caught Tom's eye across the yard, and the boy just shrugged, wide-eyed clearly, as much in the dark as she was. Supper that evening was tense, in a way it hadn't been since her first night. The hands ate quietly, throwing glances toward the empty seat at the head of the table, where Caleb usually didn't sit, but whose absence somehow still loomed over the whole room. Clara carried a plate up herself, same as always, and knocked on the study door. "Come in." She'd never been invited into that room before. She pushed the door open slowly and found Caleb surrounded by papers, deeds, ledgers, yellowed letters spread across his desk like a man trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "You found something," she said. "I found a great many things." He didn't look up. "None of them make sense yet." "May I?" He hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him, and Clara set the plate down and sat watching him sort through papers with the desperate focus of a man who hadn't let himself think about anything but land and lies for 6 straight hours. "The deed on file in town," he said, "has my father's signature on it, dated 1868, same year as the real one. But my father's real signature," he pulled an old letter from a drawer and laid it beside the copied deed, "loops his C differently. See here, small thing. Nobody'd notice unless they'd read 100 letters from him like I have." Clara leaned closer, studying both signatures. "It's a forgery. A damn good one. Whoever did this studied my father's hand for months, maybe years." Caleb rubbed his eyes, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "And the land agent who filed it on behalf of the so-called rightful owner man, by the name of Elias Pratt, nobody in town's ever laid eyes on him. He's not local. He's not from any county I know." "Who hired him?" Caleb's eyes finally lifted to hers. "That's what I intend to find out." He paused. "The clerk at the land office let something slip, though. Said Pratt's paperwork mentioned a business partner, a financier bankrolling the claim. Somebody with real money behind him, patient enough to wait years for the right moment to strike. A name. Not yet. But the clerk said the man's been asking about Whitmore Land for the better part of a year. Long before you ever answered my advertisement, Clara." His voice softened just slightly. So, whatever's happening here, it started before you arrived. I owe you an apology for last night. Clara's chest loosened for the first time since the storm. Thank you. Don't thank me. I was wrong to accuse you before I had the facts. My father used to say a man who judges before he investigates isn't much of a man at all. He managed something close to a wry, exhausted smile. I forgot that for a night. Won't happen again. You were scared, Clara said gently. Fear makes fools of the smartest men. Is that supposed to comfort me? It's supposed to be the truth. Comfort's extra. That earned an actual laugh, short, rusty like a door hinge that hadn't swung open in years, and it changed his whole face. Softened, the hard lines around his eyes made him look just for a moment like a man who might remember how to be young again. Clara found herself staring and looked away quickly, cheeks warming for reasons that had nothing to do with the stove downstairs. You should eat, she said, nodding at the plate. Before it goes cold. You keep saying that. You keep needing reminding. He ate while he worked, and she stayed not quite sure why, sorting through old letters at his request, searching for anything that might mention Elias Pratt, or a financier with grudges against the Whitmore name. The hours slipped by, unnoticed, candles burning low. The two of them bent over yellowed paper, in comfortable, focused silence that neither wanted to break. It was well past midnight when Clara's fingers stilled on a letter, old and water-stained, tucked in the back of a drawer marked only with the year 1879. Caleb. Something in her voice made him look up immediately. What is it? She held the letter out with a hand that wasn't quite steady. This is addressed to your father, from a lawyer in Denver. It mentions a land dispute, a partnership gone sour back before you were born over grazing rights on the very same north pasture. She scanned it again, disbelieving. It says your father bought out his partner's share for pennies on the dollar after the man's cattle operation failed. The partner's name. What's the name, Clara? She looked up at him and something cold settled in her stomach. Holloway. Bartholomew Holloway. Caleb went very still. That family's got money in half of Montana now, he said slowly. Cattle, railroads, banks. Old Bartholomew died years back, but he's got a son, Richard Holloway. His voice hardened into something Clara hadn't heard from him before. Richard's been trying to buy up ranch land across 3 counties for the better part of a decade. If his father lost this land to mine 40 years ago, and he's spent his whole life resenting it, then this isn't about money at all, Clara finished. This is revenge. The candle between them flickered violently, though no draft stirred it, and for a long moment the two of them simply stared at each other across a desk littered with 40 years of buried secrets, both realizing at once that whatever was coming for the Whitmore ranch had roots far deeper and far older than either of them had imagined. There's something else, Clara said slowly, dread pooling in her stomach as she turned the letter over. This is dated 3 months before your father married your mother. It mentions... She squinted at the faded ink. It mentions a woman. Says Holloway threatened to expose something about her past unless your father paid him double for the land. Caleb's face drained of color. My mother. I don't know if that's who it means, but Caleb, Clara's voice dropped. If Richard Holloway's father used to threaten people's pasts to get what he wanted, and now his son's doing the very same thing to me, then history's repeating itself. And I'm about to lose everything my father built the exact same way he almost lost it 40 years ago. Caleb stood so fast, his chair scraped back hard against the floor. Except this time, he's not just coming for the land. What do you mean? Caleb looked at her, something fierce and protective flaring behind his stormy eyes. He's coming for you too, to weaken me, to make sure I can't fight back with a clear head. He shook his head slowly. God help me, Clara. I think you walked into something a great deal bigger than either of us understood. Before Clara could respond, the sound of hooves thundered into the yard again, too fast, too urgent for anyone bringing good news at this hour. Caleb was moving before the knock even came Clara right behind him. Both of them descending the stairs, 2 at a time, as pounding fists hit the front door hard enough to rattle the frame. He threw it open to find Tom standing there, breathless face pale, in the lantern light blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. Tom. What happened? Ryder's boss. 3 of them out past the north fence. Cutting wire moving cattle toward the boundary line Pratt's claiming as his. I tried to stop 'em, and one of 'em pistol whipped me for my trouble. Are you hurt bad? I'll live. But boss? Tom's eyes flicked nervously toward Clara, then back to Caleb. One of 'em said something strange while they had me down. Said to tell you the widow ought to remember what happened to the last man who trusted her too quick. The words hit the yard like a gunshot. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. That's not possible, she whispered. Nobody here knows about what, Clara? Caleb turned to her sharply. She swallowed, hard hands trembling at her sides. Before my husband died, before the fever took him. There was a man in our town, a business associate of his, who died in a riding accident just weeks before everything fell apart. Folks whispered that the accident wasn't an accident at all. That maybe her voice broke. That maybe I had a hand in it. There was never any proof, never any charge brought against me. Just whispers, same as everything else. The yard went silent, except for Tom's ragged breathing and the wind moving through the fence line. You think Richard Holloway dug up rumors from a town 200 miles away? Caleb said slowly. Rumors so old and so unfounded even you'd nearly forgotten them, and he's using them now tonight to threaten my ranch hands into fearing you. I think, Clara said, voice shaking but steady, that a man capable of forging a 40-year-old signature is more than capable of digging up whatever ugliness he needs to destroy the people standing in his way. And right now, Caleb, that's both of us. Caleb turned to Tom. Get Jeb. Wake every hand on this ranch. Nobody rides alone from here forward, and nobody touches Whitmore land without answering to me first. Yes, sir. Tom disappeared into the dark, and Caleb turned back to Clara, standing in the doorway of a house that had gone from silent to besieged in the span of one storm-soaked week. I owe you another apology, he said quietly. For what? Forever doubting even for a moment that you were the danger here. His jaw tightened. You're not the danger, Clara. You're the target, and I intend to make sure Richard Holloway regrets ever setting his sights on this ranch or on you. Something in Clara's chest cracked open at those words. Not fear this time, but something warmer, more dangerous in its own way. A feeling she hadn't let herself feel since she buried her husband 3 years ago. You don't owe me protection, she said softly. That wasn't part of the arrangement either. Maybe, Caleb said, echoing words from days before, I'm rewriting the arrangement again. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the lantern light flickering between them, the whole ranch holding its breath around them. Then Jeb's voice cut through the yard, urgent and sharp, calling every hand to arms, and the moment shattered into motion, men grabbing rifles, saddling horses. The whole ranch transforming in minutes from a house of grief into a house preparing for war. The next 3 days passed in a blur of exhaustion and vigilance. Caleb doubled the watch along the fence lines. He rode into town twice more, returning each time with his jaw tighter, his silence heavier, though he shared what little he learned with Clara each night, over cold supper in his study. The two of them bent together over papers and letters like conspirators piecing together a war plan. The land office clerk finally admitted it, Caleb said on the third night, sliding a paper across the desk toward her. Richard Holloway's been the financier behind Elias Pratt from the start. Pratt's nothing but a hired gun with a law license. Holloway's the one who wants this land, and he's been planning this for the better part of a year. Why now? Why wait so long? Wait so? Because he needed proof his father's claim held water, and because... Caleb hesitated, something dark crossing his face. Because he needed me distracted, weakened. A man grieving alone for 5 years is easy prey, Clara. A man who's finally starting to live again, starting to laugh again, starting to... He stopped himself. Starting to what? Clara asked quietly. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing behind his eyes. Starting to feel something again, he said finally. That man's harder to break, so Holloway's trying to break it before it takes root. The candle between them burned low, and Clara found herself holding her breath, aware suddenly of how close they were sitting, how the space between them had shrunk night after night, without either of them quite noticing. "Caleb, I know what I'm risking saying this," he said, cutting her off gently. "I know it's foolish with everything crashing down around this ranch right now, but I haven't felt like myself in 5 years, Clara. Not until you walked up my steps calling me a man who hadn't slept. And I don't want Holloway or anyone else taking that away before I've even had the chance to understand what it means." Clara's heart pounded so loud she was certain he could hear it. "I buried a husband," she whispered. "I promised myself I wouldn't let myself feel this again, not after everything it cost me the first time." "I'm not asking you to promise anything," Caleb said. "I'm just telling you the truth. Whatever's coming for this ranch, whatever Holloway throws at us, I'd rather face it standing beside you than alone in this house, the way I've been facing everything for 5 years. The lantern flickered between them, and for a moment, just a moment, Clara let herself lean the smallest fraction closer, let herself imagine what it might feel like to stop running from warmth after 3 years of nothing but cold. Then the door burst open. Jeb stood there breathless, hat gone face white as bone. "Boss, you need to come now." "What happened?" "It's the cattle. The whole north herd, boss. Somebody drove 'em clean through the boundary fence overnight and into Pratt's claimed section. And there's a man out there right now standing in your own pasture with a legal notice in his hand, telling anybody who'll listen that Whitmore land's about to belong to somebody else entirely." Caleb was on his feet instantly, all warmth gone from his face, replaced by cold, hard fury. "Get my horse." "Caleb, wait." Clara grabbed his arm before he could move past her. "If you ride out there angry, you play right into his hands. That's exactly what he wants, you reckless, you making a mistake he can use against you." Caleb stopped breathing hard and looked down at her hand on his arm. "Then what do you suggest?" "You go out there," Clara said steadily, "and you go out there calm. You let him see a man who isn't afraid, who isn't broken, who's got nothing to hide and everything to fight for. Because that's the version of you he's most afraid of, Caleb, not the angry one. The steady one." Something shifted in his face, respect maybe, or something even warmer. "You're a remarkable woman, Clara Bennett." "I'm a practical one. There's a difference, but I'll let you believe whichever you like." He almost smiled, even in the middle of chaos. And then he was moving, calling for his horse, calling for Jeb, and every hand on the property, and within minutes, the entire Whitmore ranch was riding hard toward the north pasture under a sky just beginning to lighten with dawn. Clara followed on the old mare Jeb kept for errands, heart-hammering, praying she hadn't just sent the man she was falling for straight into a trap. They found the north pasture crawling with strangers. 6 men on horseback, cattle scattered and bawling across the boundary line, and in the middle of it all, a thin man in a black coat holding rolled papers like a weapon, flanked by 2 men who looked far more comfortable with pistols than paperwork. "Elias Pratt, I presume," Caleb said, reining his horse to a stop close enough to loom but far enough to remain civil. "Mr. Whitmore." Pratt's smile was thin and cold. "I was hoping we might avoid unpleasantness. My client has a legitimate claim to this section filed and recorded proper, and I'm afraid your cattle are currently trespassing on land that isn't yours any longer. That deed's forged, and you know it. That's a serious accusation, sir. One you'd need proof to make stick in front of a judge. I have proof." Caleb's voice was ice calm, exactly the steadiness Clara had begged him for. "I have my father's genuine signature from a dozen letters spanning 20 years, every one of them showing a hand that doesn't match whatever forgery your client filed. I have a letter from 1879 detailing the original sale between my father and Bartholomew Holloway Fair, and legal and witnessed. And I have a very strong suspicion, Mr. Pratt, that your real client isn't some mysterious stranger with an old claim, but Richard Holloway himself, still bitter after 40 years that his father sold this land honestly and simply couldn't compete with a better rancher." Pratt's smile faltered just slightly. "That's quite an imagination, Mr. Whitmore." "It's quite a lot of evidence, Mr. Pratt, and it'll all be sitting on a judge's desk in Helena by week's end." Caleb's eyes swept over the armed men flanking Pratt. Now get your men and whatever cattle you've stolen off my land overnight, and get off Whitmore property before I stop being the steady man my cook keeps insisting I should be." A tense silence stretched across the pasture hooves, shifting nervously beneath dozens of riders, on both sides, hands hovering just close enough to holsters to make Clara's heart climb into her throat. Then from behind Pratt's men, a new rider emerged, unhurried, expensive coat, immaculate despite the early hour, a cold smile already fixed in place. "There's no need for guns," the man said smoothly, "when the truth will do the job far more effectively." Caleb's whole body went rigid. "Holloway, Mr. Whitmore." Richard Holloway inclined his head with mocking politeness. "I was hoping to introduce myself properly before things got quite this heated. But since we're already here..." His eyes slid past Caleb, landing directly on Clara, with a slow, deliberate cruelty that made her stomach turn to ice. "And this must be the famous Widow Bennet. I've heard so very much about you, Mrs. Bennet. Your old town was positively bursting with stories once I started asking the right questions." "Leave her out of this," Caleb said, voice dropping dangerously low. "I'm afraid that's not entirely possible." Holloway's smile widened. "You see, Mr. Whitmore, I've spent the better part of a year studying exactly how to bring your family's ranch to its knees, and I confess, when I learned you'd finally hired help after 5 years of grieving alone, I thought it might simply speed along your inevitable collapse." His gaze flicked back to Clara. "I never expected the widow herself to be quite so convenient a weapon. A woman with a suspicious death trailing her from her last town. Rumors of poisoning, wasn't it? Or was it something else entirely they whispered about you, Mrs. Bennet?" "There was never any poisoning," Clara said, forcing steel into her voice, despite the way her hands trembled at her sides. "There was never any charge, any evidence, any proof of wrongdoing whatsoever because I did nothing wrong. You're grasping at old gossip because you have nothing real to threaten either of us with." "Gossip has a funny way of becoming truth once enough frightened people repeat it," Holloway said pleasantly. "Ask my father. He built half his fortune convincing frightened men to sell cheap rather than fight a rumor." His eyes cut back to Caleb. "I'll be generous, Mr. Whitmore. Sell me the north pasture at a fair price quietly, and I'll make certain the widow's unfortunate history stays buried in the town she left behind. Refuse, and I'll make sure every rancher, every banker, every soul in 3 counties knows exactly what kind of woman you've let into your home and your bed." The pasture went utterly silent. Even the cattle seemed to still. Caleb's horse shifted beneath him, sensing the fury radiating off its rider, and for one terrible moment Clara feared he might do something reckless enough to hand Holloway exactly the victory he wanted. Instead, Caleb swung down off his horse, slow and deliberate, and walked directly toward Richard Holloway, until they stood close enough that every man in that pasture could hear exactly what came next. "My father," Caleb said quietly, "spent his whole life building something honest out of hard land and harder winters. He never once needed to threaten a frightened woman to get what he wanted. That's the difference between us, Holloway. You inherited your father's money. I inherited my father's character. And no amount of buried rumors, forged signatures, or hired guns is going to convince me to trade the second thing for the first. Careful, Whitmore. Pride's an expensive thing to hold on to when you're about to lose everything your father built." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but I'd rather lose it standing beside an honest woman than keep it by handing you a victory built on lies." He turned deliberately and walked back toward Clara, close enough that the entire pasture understood exactly where he stood, exactly what he'd chosen. "Get off my land, Holloway, and take your forged paper and your borrowed rumors with you." For a long, taut moment, Richard Holloway simply stared at them both, his cold smile flickering, calculating, recalculating. Then he laughed, soft, unhurried, chilling in its calm. "You've made this so much more interesting, Mr. Whitmore. I do love a challenge." He gathered his reins. "I'll see you in Helena, then. And Mrs. Bennet." His eyes found hers one last time, glittering with something far darker than mere business ambition. "I do hope you're prepared for exactly how far I'm willing to go once a man like me feels truly challenged. This is only the beginning. He wheeled his horse and rode off unhurried across the very pasture he'd just claimed didn't belong to Caleb, his men and Pratt trailing behind him, leaving nothing but settling dust and the frightened lowing of scattered cattle in his wake. Clara let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for an hour, her whole body shaking now that the danger had passed, at least for the moment. "That was reckless," she said, though her voice carried more admiration than accusation. "Probably," Caleb agreed, watching the dust settle where Holloway had disappeared over the ridge. "He's going to come after us harder now." "I know." Caleb turned to her, and despite everything, despite the forged deeds and the stolen cattle and the threats hanging over both their heads, something steady and certain burned behind his stormy eyes. "But he made one mistake out there today, Clara." "What's that?" "He threatened you in front of every hand on this ranch, thinking it would scare me into abandoning you to protect the land." Caleb reached out gently and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so tender it stole the breath clean out of her lungs. Instead, it just proved to every single one of them exactly what I already knew standing in my own kitchen a week ago, the very first night you cooked for this ranch. "And what's that?" she whispered. "That some things," Caleb said quietly, "are worth fighting for a great deal harder than land ever could be." Behind them, Jeb cleared his throat loudly, and half the ranch hands suddenly found the horizon fascinating, though more than one wore the ghost of a knowing grin. Clara felt heat rush to her cheeks, but she didn't step back, didn't look away, because for the first time in 3 long years, she found herself standing in the middle of danger and rumor and threat, and feeling impossibly safer than she had anywhere else on earth. But even as Caleb helped her back onto her horse, even as the ranch hands began the long work of driving the scattered cattle back across the true boundary line, Clara couldn't shake the cold certainty settling deep in her stomach. Richard Holloway hadn't looked like a man who'd been defeated that morning. He'd looked like a man who'd simply started enjoying the game. And somewhere between the forged deed, the stolen cattle, and the rumors he'd promised to spread across 3 counties, Clara understood with sickening clarity that the true fight for the Whitmore Ranch, and for whatever fragile, impossible thing had just begun blooming between her and Caleb, hadn't even started yet. By the time they rode back into the yard, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the last of the morning chill, but nothing about the ranch felt warm anymore. Clara dismounted stiffly, her legs unsteady beneath her, and watched Caleb bark orders to the hands about mending the cut fence line and moving the herd back where it belonged. His voice was calm, controlled. But she'd learned enough about this man in 2 short weeks to see the tension coiled tight behind his shoulders, the way his hand kept drifting to rest on the grip of the pistol at his hip, even though the danger had ridden off over the ridge. "He's not finished," she said quietly, once the hands had scattered to their work. "I know. He's going to do exactly what he said, spread whatever ugly story he's dug up about me across every town in 3 counties. Caleb turned to her, jaw tight. "Let him try. You don't understand what that kind of talk does to a person, Caleb." Her voice shook not from fear now, but from something older, something worn smooth by 3 years of exactly this. "It doesn't matter that none of it's true. It doesn't matter that there was never a charge, never a trial, never one shred of proof. People don't remember facts. They remember the shape of a rumor, and that shape follows you into every room you ever walk into again. Then we make sure the truth is louder than the rumor. And if it isn't, if it never is." She looked away out toward the pasture where the cattle were slowly being driven back across the true line. "I watched a whole town turn on me in the space of a single church service, Caleb. One Sunday, I was the grieving widow they brought casseroles to. The next, I was the woman nobody would sit beside. That's how fast it happens. That's how little truth matters once fear gets there first." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Is that why you left?" It wasn't a question, not really. Clara nodded anyway. There wasn't anything left to stay for. No husband, no income, no friend willing to be seen with me in daylight. She let out a breath that trembled on its way out. "Your advertisement was the first door that opened in 3 years, Caleb. No personal questions. I would have taken that job if you'd asked me to muck out stalls with my bare hands, because it meant somewhere in this world my past didn't have to walk in the door before I did. It's walking in the door now. I know. Her eyes met his glassy but fierce. And I won't let it burn your ranch down around you. I won't be the reason you lose everything your father built. Clara. I mean it, Caleb. She stepped back before he could reach for her. Holloway wants a war. He's got money, lawyers' patience, and 40 years of grudge behind him. What he doesn't have yet is a reason to make it personal beyond land and pride. The moment he realizes how much you've come to... She stumbled over the word, cheeks coloring even in the middle of crisis. How much you care he'll use it. He already tried this morning. He'll try harder next time. And I won't be the weapon somebody uses to take this ranch away from 12 good men who finally started laughing again at supper. So what exactly are you proposing? Caleb's voice had gone low, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with fear he wasn't ready to name. I'm proposing that maybe I should have never stayed this long. The words hit the yard like a slap. You don't mean that. I mean every word of it. But her voice cracked, even as she said it, betraying her. Caleb closed the distance between them in 2 strides, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. Look me in the eye, Clara Bennett, and tell me you want to leave. Not that you think you should. Not that it would be safer or simpler or kinder to everyone else. Tell me you want to walk away from this ranch, from these hands who love you like family already, from... His voice dropped. From me. Tell me that's what you want, and I'll hitch the wagon myself. Clara opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because it wasn't true, and they both knew it, and the silence stretched between them until it became its own kind of answer. That's what I thought, Caleb said softly. Wanting to stay, and it being wise to stay, aren't the same thing. No, he agreed. But I've spent 5 years doing what was safe, Clara, eating alone, sleeping alone, building walls so thick around what was left of my heart that I nearly forgot it was still beating in there at all. Safe isn't a life. It's just a slower kind of dying. He reached out gently, and this time she let him take her hand. I'd rather fight Richard Holloway with everything I've got standing beside you than win this war alone and have nobody left worth sharing the victory with. For a moment, one long, fragile moment, Clara let herself lean into that, let herself believe it might actually be possible to build something new out of 2 broken lives, instead of running from the wreckage the way she'd run from everything else. Then Jeb came jogging across the yard, hat in hand, face grim in a way that snapped them both back to the danger still circling. Boss, Ryder just came from town. Thought you'd want to hear this straight from me before you heard it secondhand. What is it? Holloway's already talking. Been in the saloon since noon buying rounds telling anybody who'll listen that Whitmore's gone and hired himself a black widow. Says the last man who trusted you, ma'am. Jeb's eyes flicked apologetically to Clara. Died awful convenient right before you inherited whatever debts he left behind. Says folks ought to wonder what really happened out here on Whitmore land, with the boss suddenly softening up, right when a stranger with a bad reputation walked onto his property. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. That's not what happened. That man wasn't my husband. He was a business partner, and his death was a genuine accident, and there was never... I know, ma'am. Jeb's voice was gentle, apologetic. Ain't a man on this ranch believes a word of it. But town folk who don't know you, they're gonna believe whatever story gets told, loudest and most often, and Holloway's got the money to make sure it's told plenty loud. Caleb's grip on Clara's hand tightened. How bad is it? Bad enough that Reverend Collins is already asking around about canceling the church social you two were meant to attend Sunday. Bad enough the mercantile owner's wife was heard saying she wouldn't sell flour to a woman with blood on her conscience. Jeb winced. I'm sorry to be the one bringing it, boss, but you needed to hear it before you rode into town blind. The yard felt smaller, suddenly the whole world narrowing down to the sick, cold feeling spreading through Clara's chest. I told you, she whispered. This is exactly what I told you would happen. And I told you we'd face it together. Together isn't going to unpoison an entire county's opinion in a single afternoon, Caleb." Her voice rose sharp with panic she couldn't quite contain anymore. "This isn't a fence line we can mend, or a herd we can drive back across a boundary. This is my name, dragged through the mud in a town I've lived in less than 3 weeks, and it's happening because of me. Because I walked onto your land and brought a war with me that has nothing to do with cattle or deeds." "Clara, no, listen to me." She pulled her hand free, chest heaving. "I watched my husband's good name get buried alongside him because of rumors neither of us could control. I am not going to watch yours suffer the same fate, not when I have the power to stop it before it goes any further." "And how exactly do you intend to stop it?" Clara's jaw set something hard and resolute settling behind her eyes. "I'm going to leave Caleb. Tonight. Before Holloway has anything real to threaten you with, before this gets any worse for you, or these men, or this ranch. I'll take the morning stage out of the territory, and by the time anyone thinks to ask where the widow went, I'll be 3 counties gone, and there won't be anything left for Holloway to use against you." "Absolutely not. It's not your decision to make. The hell it isn't when it's my ranch, my hands, my name being dragged into whatever you're about to sacrifice yourself over." Caleb's voice had gone rough raw in a way she hadn't heard from him even in the depths of his grief. "You think running is going to protect me? You think I'll sleep easier knowing you're out there alone somewhere, still carrying a reputation you didn't earn, still hiding from a fight you didn't start? I think," Clara said, voice breaking, "that I would rather live with a broken heart than watch you lose everything your father built because you were too stubborn to let me go." The words hung between them raw and terrible, and for a moment neither of them moved, both of them standing in the wreckage of a fight neither one wanted to be having. Then Caleb did something Clara didn't expect. He laughed. Short, disbelieving, almost bitter. "You think I care about the ranch? Caleb, I built my whole life around not caring about anything I could lose again, Clara. Do you understand that 5 years I made sure nothing in this world could hurt me the way losing Sarah hurt me, because I decided the safest thing a man could do was never let anything matter enough to break him twice." His voice cracked, finally, the wall he'd kept so carefully mortared for 5 long years crumbling right there in the yard in front of her. "And then you walked up my porch steps with a suitcase and a sharp tongue, and inside of 2 weeks you made me care again. About supper, about my own men, about whether or not I slept at night, about you." He stepped closer, and this time she didn't step back. "So no, Clara. I don't give a damn about this ranch if it means losing you to save it. My father built this place with his hands. But you're the reason I remembered how to use my heart again. I am not letting Richard Holloway, or a town full of gossips, or your own fear take that away from me twice in one lifetime." Clara stood, frozen tears finally spilling over 3 years of careful, guarded distance, collapsing all at once under the weight of a man who'd just told her in the middle of a yard full of danger and rumor exactly what she meant to him. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. Not of Holloway. Of this. Of you. Of wanting something again after I promised myself I never would. I never." "I know that too," Caleb said softly, reaching up to brush the tears from her cheek with a gentleness that undid her completely. "I'm terrified too, Clara, every single day since you got here. But I'd rather be terrified beside you than safe and empty the way I was before. For a moment, the danger, the forged deeds, the whispered rumors in town, all of it fell away, and there was only the 2 of them standing in the yard, closer than they'd ever been. His hand cupping her face, her breath catching as he leaned down. A gunshot cracked through the air. Clara screamed as Caleb yanked her down behind the water trough, on instinct, both of them hitting the ground hard. Hearts slamming as a second shot splintered the wood of the porch railing not 4 feet from where they'd been standing. "Get down! Everybody, get down!" Jeb's voice roared across the yard as hands scrambled for rifles, diving for cover behind wagons and fence posts. "Where's it coming from?" Caleb shouted, drawing his own pistol, shielding Clara's body with his own without a second thought. "Ridge line north side," Tom's voice panicked from somewhere near the barn. 3 more shots rang out wild, more warning than aim, kicking up dirt near the porch steps, and then as fast as it started, silence. Distant hoofbeats retreating hard and fast toward the northern boundary toward Holloway land. The whole ranch held its breath. "Everybody all right?" Caleb called, voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Sound off." One by one the hands called back, shaken but unhurt, until finally Jeb came sprinting around the side of the house, rifle still raised, eyes wild. "Boss, you and Mrs. Bennett hurt." "We're fine." Caleb helped Clara to her feet, both of them trembling, adrenaline coursing hot through their veins. "That wasn't meant to hit anybody." "No," Clara said slowly, staring at the splintered porch railing. "That was meant to send a message. Holloway's not just threatening reputations anymore," Caleb said grimly. "He's threatening lives. Which means he's scared." Clara said something steely, returning to her voice, even as her hands shook. "A man that confident in his lawyers and his forged paper doesn't need to fire warning shots into a ranch yard. He does that when the paper trail isn't as solid as he wants us to believe, and the only thing left in his arsenal is fear." Caleb looked at her, something like awe cutting through his fury. "You're not wrong. I'm rarely wrong when it comes to desperate men," Clara said. And despite everything, despite the bullet holes and the trembling hands and the rumors spreading through town like wildfire, something in her chest steadied, because for the first time since the storm, she understood exactly what kind of fight this actually was. Not a fight over land. A fight over fear itself, whose fear would win. "I'm not leaving," she said suddenly. Caleb turned to her, surprised. "Clara, I changed my mind. Running doesn't protect you, Caleb. You said it yourself. And you're right, it doesn't protect me either. It just gives men like Holloway exactly what they want, which is silence. Compliance. A frightened woman disappearing quietly into the night so the rumor gets to stand as truth, forever unchallenged." Her chin lifted, something fierce and unbreakable settling into her spine. "I've spent 3 years running from whispers. I'm done running. If Richard Holloway wants a fight, he's going to get every ounce of one I've got left in me." A slow, proud smile broke across Caleb's face, despite the chaos still settling around them. "That's the woman who told me I hadn't slept in 5 years the day we met." "That woman's not going anywhere," Clara said. "Not this time." Jeb cleared his throat. "As much as I'm enjoying this, boss, might I suggest we get everybody inside before whoever fired those shots decides to come back with better aim." They moved quickly. After that, hands doubling the watch rifles distributed lanterns dimmed to make the house a harder target after dark. Clara found herself in the kitchen, an hour later, hands still trembling as she sliced bread for a hastily thrown-together supper, when Caleb appeared in the doorway, freshly changed, a fresh rifle slung over his shoulder. "You should eat something too," she said without looking up. "You've been running on nothing but fury since sunup." "I will." He crossed the kitchen close enough that she finally looked up from the bread. "Clara, I need you to know something in case tonight or tomorrow or any day this week doesn't go the way we're hoping." "Don't talk like that. I need to say it anyway." His voice was steady, but his eyes were raw. "Whatever happens with Holloway, whatever the town decides to believe about you, whatever it costs me to fight this, I don't regret a single day since you walked up my porch steps. Not one. You gave me back things I thought I'd buried with Sarah. My laughter, my appetite, my reason to get out of bed some mornings that had nothing to do with cattle at all." He reached for her hand, flower and all. "I love you, Clara Bennett. I know it's fast, and I know the timing is a disaster, and I know half this county's about to try to convince me I've lost my mind, but I needed you to hear it before whatever comes next." Clara's breath caught the knife slipping from her fingers to clatter against the cutting board, forgotten. "Caleb, you don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know." But she was already closing the distance between them. Flour-dusted hands framing his face. And when she kissed him, it wasn't hesitant or careful, the way she'd imagined it might be, in the quiet moments she'd never let herself dwell on. It was certain. Fierce. 3 years of carefully guarded grief finally breaking loose all at once. "I love you too," she whispered against his mouth. "God help me, I do." Somewhere outside, Jeb whooped loud enough to be heard through the kitchen window, clearly having chosen exactly the wrong or perfectly right moment to walk past with an armful of firewood, and Clara laughed against Caleb's lips, the sound startled and bright, and more alive than she'd felt in 3 long years. The moment didn't last. It never did not on the Whitmore ranch that week. A rider came pounding into the yard just after dawn the next morning, and this time it wasn't Holloway's men delivering threats from a distance. It was the county sheriff himself, face grim of folded paper in his gloved hand. "Caleb Whitmore," the sheriff called from atop his horse. "I've got a warrant here requiring the widow Bennett to appear before the circuit judge in Helena on formal inquiry." Clara's blood ran cold. "Inquiry into what exactly?" Caleb demanded, striding forward, putting himself between Clara and the sheriff without seeming to think twice about it. Into the death of one Walter Higgins, her late husband's business associate back in... The sheriff consulted the paper, back in her home county, 3 years past. Mr. Holloway's lawyer filed a formal complaint yesterday, claiming new evidence has come to light, suggesting foul play, and demanding the matter finally be properly investigated instead of left to rumor. "That's absurd," Caleb snapped. "There was never any evidence of foul play. It was a riding accident ruled so by the coroner at the time. Be that as it may, Mr. Whitmore, a formal complaint's been filed, and the judge has ordered an inquiry. Mrs. Bennett's required to appear in 3 days' time." Clara stood frozen, the ground seeming to tilt beneath her feet, 3 years of careful, painful healing threatening to collapse in on itself all at once. "And if I refuse?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff's expression softened just slightly, the first hint of sympathy he'd shown since riding into the yard. "Then a warrant gets issued for your arrest, ma'am, and it stops being a quiet inquiry and starts being something a great deal more public and a great deal harder to walk back from." He tipped his hat, apologetic. "I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door, Mr. Whitmore. I don't much care for being Holloway's errand boy, truth told, but the law's the law, and a filed complaint's a filed complaint." He left the warrant in Caleb's hand and rode off, leaving the two of them standing in the yard once more, the fragile joy of the night before, crushed beneath the weight of what was coming. 3 days, Clara whispered. "He's going to drag my husband's memory my whole life into a courtroom in front of the entire county in 3 days. "Then we'll be ready," Caleb said, though his voice carried none of the certainty it had the day before. "Ready how, Caleb? There's no evidence to fight because there was never any crime to begin with. It's rumor dressed up as law, and rumor doesn't care about truth. It only cares about doubt, and Holloway's already planted enough of that in 3 counties to bury me before I ever step foot in that courtroom. Then we find the truth about who actually caused Walter Higgins's accident, and we bring it into that courtroom ourselves." Caleb's jaw was set determination burning behind the fear in his eyes. "You said it yourself yesterday, Clara. Holloway's firing warning shots because he's scared, not because he's certain. A man with real evidence doesn't need to manufacture a legal inquiry out of 3-year-old gossip. He needs to make you look guilty because deep down, he knows you're not. That's a comforting theory. It's not proof." "No," Caleb agreed. "But we've got 3 days to find some." He turned to call for Jeb, already formulating some plan of investigation letters to send records to request from her old county. But Clara stood rooted to the spot, staring down at the warrant crumpled in Caleb's fist, and felt something cold and certain settle over her that she hadn't felt since the night her husband died. Because there was one detail about Walter Higgins's death that she had never told anyone. Not her husband's family. Not the coroner. Not a single soul in 3 years buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it didn't matter, that it changed nothing, that it was better left in the ground with him. But if Richard Holloway's lawyers had dug deep enough to find rumors from a town 200 miles away, deep enough to forge a 40-year-old signature and unearth a decade-old grudge, there was a real and terrible chance they'd dug deep enough to find that too. "Caleb," she said, and something in her voice made him stop mid-stride, and turned back to her alarm flashing across his face at whatever he saw in her expression. "What is it?" Clara's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to still them 3 years of silence rising up her throat like a tide she could no longer hold back. "There's something about that night I never told anyone," she said quietly. "Something that could look a great deal worse than an accident if the wrong person found out and twisted it the right way." Her eyes lifted to his glassy with unshed tears and something that looked almost like relief at finally letting the words out. "And I think you need to sit down, Caleb, because before Holloway drags me into that courtroom and tells this story his way, I owe you the chance to hear it told true, straight from me, no matter what it costs us both to hear it." Caleb sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the warrant still crumpled in his fist, and looked up at Clara with an expression that held more fear for her than for himself. "Tell me," he said quietly. Clara pressed her palms flat against the table to keep them from shaking. "Walter Higgins wasn't just my husband's business partner," she began. "He managed our household accounts too near the end when my husband's health started failing before the fever ever took him. I trusted him. Everyone did. He had a way of making people feel foolish for questioning him." "Go on." "About 2 weeks before he died, I found a ledger in my husband's desk that didn't match what Walter had been telling us about the brokerage. Numbers moved around. Money that should have gone to investors sitting instead in accounts with Walter's name on them." Her voice wavered. "I confronted him, alone, at his office on a Tuesday evening, because I didn't want to worry my husband while he was already so weak." "What did he say?" "He laughed at me first. Told me I didn't understand business, that widows shouldn't meddle in men's affairs. Then when I told him I intended to bring the ledger to my husband regardless, he changed. Got ugly. Grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise. Told me if I said one word to anybody, he'd make sure the whole town believed I was stealing from my own husband to cover gambling debts I never had." Her jaw tightened at the memory. "I pulled free and left. He rode out after me, still shouting, still furious. That's the last time I saw him alive. They found his horse the next morning thrown from a ridge trail 2 miles outside town, his neck broken." Caleb's face had gone very still. "And you never told anyone the argument happened. Who would have believed me? Caleb, a widow with a dead husband's business partner found dead the same night she'd quarreled with him. I panicked. I took the ledger and I burned it because I thought if anyone found it, they'd say I killed him to hide the theft myself, or worse, that I killed him out of some kind of revenge." Tears finally spilled over 3 years of silence, breaking loose all at once. "I've carried that lie every single day since. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I was too frightened to trust that the truth would ever be enough to protect me." The kitchen was silent except for the crackle of the stove and Clara's uneven breathing. "You burned evidence of fraud," Caleb said slowly. "Yes. Evidence that would have proven Walter Higgins was stealing from investors, including your own husband." "Yes." "Clara!" Caleb reached across the table and took both her trembling hands in his. "That's not a confession of guilt. That's a terrified young widow protecting the only thing she had left, her husband's good name, from a dead man who'd already ruined enough lives. I'm not angry. I'm not afraid of you. I understand exactly why you did it. You might be the only person in this territory who will. Then we make sure the judge in Helena understands it too." Caleb's grip tightened around her hands. "But Clara, if there was fraud, real fraud numbers moved and hidden in accounts under Higgins' name, that ledger might not have just been evidence against him. It might connect to something bigger." Clara looked up, something sharpening behind her tears. "What do you mean?" "I mean, a man doesn't get careless enough to steal from his own partners unless he's desperate, or unless somebody bigger is squeezing him from above." Caleb's eyes had gone distant, calculating. "You said the numbers moved into accounts under his name. Did you ever see who those accounts answered to?" Was there a bank, a financier, anybody backing Higgins's brokerage in the first place? Clara frowned, memory straining. There was a name on some of the transfer papers, a bank in Denver. I only remember it because it seemed odd for a small-town brokerage to be dealing with a Denver institution at all. Do you remember the name? Clara closed her eyes, reaching back 3 years into a night she'd spent every day since trying to forget. Territorial Trust, she said slowly. Territorial Trust and Cattle Exchange. Caleb's face went white. That's Holloway's bank. The words dropped into the kitchen like a stone into still water. That's not possible, Clara whispered. It's the same institution that financed half of Richard Holloway's land purchases across 3 counties these past 10 years. I've seen the name on enough closing documents to recognize it in my sleep. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped back hard against the floor, pacing now, mind-racing. Clara, what if Walter Higgins wasn't just some greedy business partner who got careless? What if he was working for Holloway from the start? What if the whole scheme that ruined your husband, the very same scheme that left you a penniless widow with a ruined name? What if that was Holloway, laying groundwork years ago, the exact same way his father tried to use blackmail against mine 40 years back? Clara's stomach turned to ice. You think Richard Holloway destroyed my husband on purpose? Years before either of us ever heard his name. I think, Caleb said grimly, that Richard Holloway has spent the better part of 2 decades quietly ruining small, honest families across this territory, one town at a time, buying up whatever's left cheap once the ruin's done its work. My father's ranch was simply the one that got away from his father 40 years ago. And now he's trying to finish what his family started on 2 fronts at once, my land and your name. If that's true, Clara said, voice shaking now with something closer to fury than fear, then Walter Higgins's death might not have been an accident at all. Caleb stopped pacing. What are you saying? I'm saying a desperate, frightened embezzler who'd just been confronted by the one person who could expose him might have been exactly the kind of loose end a man like Holloway couldn't afford to leave alive. Clara's eyes had gone hard, calculating in a way that startled even herself. What if Walter's horse didn't simply throw him? What if somebody made certain he never reached town to panic, to confess, to save himself by turning on whoever was really behind the fraud? The kitchen went silent, both of them staring at each other across a truth too enormous to fully comprehend. We have 2 days, Caleb said finally. 2 days to find proof of any of this before that inquiry, or you walk into that courtroom with nothing but your word against 3 years of rumor and whatever fresh poison Holloway's lawyer has prepared. Where would we even start? Denver, Caleb said. Territorial Trust keeps records. If Higgins had accounts there, there's a paper trail, even if it's buried. And if there's any chance somebody at that bank remembers Higgins being connected to Holloway specifically. Denver's 4 days' ride, Caleb. We don't have 4 days. No, he agreed. But I know a man in Helena who used to work as a clerk for Territorial Trust before he retired. Owes my father a favor going back 20 years. If anybody can pull records fast and quiet, it's him. Before Clara could respond, the sound of breaking glass shattered the moment, sharp and violent from somewhere upstairs. Both of them froze. That's my room, Clara breathed. Caleb was moving before she finished the sentence. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, Clara right behind him, hearts pounding, and when they burst into the small room off the pantry, they found the window shattered, curtains flapping in the night wind, and a man in dark clothing halfway through the frame, one hand already closing around the small wooden box where Clara kept what little remained of her husband's belongings. Hey! Caleb roared, and the intruder spun eyes wide with panic, dropping the box as he scrambled back toward the broken window. Caleb lunged, catching the man's coat sleeve, and for a brief, violent moment, the two of them grappled in the wreckage of broken glass, fists swinging furniture, crashing. Clara screaming for Jeb, even as she grabbed a fire poker from beside the small stove and swung it hard at the intruder's shoulder. The man cried out, twisted free of Caleb's grip, and dove through the shattered window into the dark boots, hitting the ground running before either of them could follow. By the time Jeb and two other hands came pounding up the stairs with rifles raised, the yard beyond the broken window was empty except for retreating hoofbeats fading fast toward the northern boundary. "Everybody's all right," Jeb demanded, breathless. "We're fine," Caleb said, though his knuckles were split and bleeding, breathing hard. He was after something in Clara's room. Clara knelt shakily beside the wooden box, hands trembling as she checked its contents. A few old letters, a pressed flower, her mother's recipe book, and beneath it all, folded small and yellowed with age, a single sheet of paper she'd hidden there 3 years ago and nearly forgotten in the chaos of everything since. "Caleb?" she whispered. He crossed the room instantly. "What is it?" "I didn't burn everything," she admitted, unfolding the paper with shaking hands. "I burned the ledger, but there was a letter tucked inside it from Walter to somebody named R.H., dated only days before he died. I kept it because I couldn't bring myself to destroy every trace, even though I was terrified of what it might mean if anybody found it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself it wasn't proof of anything." She held it out and Caleb read it by lantern light, his jaw tightening with every line. "He's begging for more time," Caleb said slowly. "Says the numbers won't balance if the next shipment of investor funds doesn't clear before the quarter's end. Says," his voice dropped, "says RH promised protection if the job in Montana Territory paid off first, whatever that means." "The job in Montana Territory," Clara repeated, blood running cold. "Caleb, that's this ranch. He's talking about your father's land, isn't he? Even back then, even before I ever left home." Caleb looked up from the letter, eyes blazing with a fury Clara had never seen in him before. "Richard Holloway was planning to take this ranch years before he ever heard your name," he said. "And Walter Higgins was one of his men running fraud schemes to fund it, ruining honest families along the way, to bankroll a war against my father that started before either of us understood what we were caught in the middle of." "That letter's not signed," Clara said. "RH could be anyone." "It's enough to raise questions," Caleb said. "Enough alongside everything else to make a judge wonder why Richard Holloway's bank was funding a small-town brokerage 200 miles from his usual territory, run by a man who died suspiciously, right after threatening the one woman who could expose him." He folded the letter carefully, reverently, like it was the most valuable thing he'd ever held. "This is exactly what we needed, Clara. This is the thread that unravels the whole thing." Clara stared at the letter, something between terror and vindication warring in her chest. "He tried to steal it," she said quietly. "That man tonight. He wasn't after money or jewelry. He was after this." "Which means Holloway knows it exists," Caleb said grimly. "Which means we don't have 2 days anymore, Clara. We might not even have until morning." They rode for Helena before dawn. Clara wrapped in a borrowed coat against the cold. The precious letter sewn carefully into the lining of her dress, where no thief could easily reach it. Caleb riding hard beside her with 2 armed hands flanking them the entire way, rifles ready, eyes scanning every ridge and tree line for another ambush. None came. They reached Helena by mid-afternoon, exhausted, filthy from the road, and went straight to the modest home of Caleb's old family friend, a retired bank clerk named Otis Grimwald, who answered his own door looking startled at the state of them. "Caleb Whitmore. Lord boy, you look like you rode through a war." "Close enough, Otis. I need a favor, and I need it fast." Otis Grimwald listened to the whole story over strong coffee at his kitchen table, examining the letter with the careful eyes of a man who'd spent 40 years reading financial documents for a living. And when he finally looked up, his expression was grave. "I know this hand," he said quietly. "Walter Higgins. I processed transfers from his brokerage account into Territorial Trust myself years back before I retired. Always struck me as odd small operation like his moving sums that size quarter after quarter." He tapped the letter. "And I know exactly whose authorization sat behind those transfers because I saw the signature on the wire approvals more times than I care to remember." "Whose?" Clara asked, breathless. "Richard Holloway's own hand," Otis said. "Not his bank's officers. Not some manager acting on his behalf. Richard Holloway personally authorized funds flowing in and out of Walter Higgins's brokerage for the better part of 2 years before Higgins died. I remember it specifically because it was unusual for a man of Holloway's standing to involve himself so directly in accounts that small. The kitchen went silent. "Can you testify to that?" Caleb asked. Otis hesitated, old fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "Richard Holloway's a powerful man, Caleb. Testifying against him could cost me plenty this late in my life." "Otis, please." Clara's voice cracked. "In 2 days, a judge is going to look at me like I murdered a man in cold blood, when the truth is he was drowning in fraud that a much bigger, much richer man orchestrated from behind a desk 200 miles away. If you know the truth and stay silent, you're letting an innocent woman take the blame for another man's crimes." Otis looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "My late wife," he said finally, "always told me the worst thing a man could do with the truth was sit on it out of fear. She'd have my hide if she knew I let a woman hang for something she didn't do just to protect my own comfortable retirement." He set down his coffee cup with quiet finality. "I'll testify, and I've still got copies of the wire authorizations in my personal files, kept them out of habit more than anything else. Never thought they'd matter to anybody again." Relief flooded through Clara so fast her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Otis." "Don't thank me yet, ma'am. Richard Holloway's got the best lawyers money can buy, and a whole county half convinced of your guilt already. Documents and testimony help. They don't guarantee anything in a courtroom full of frightened people looking for someone easy to blame." He wasn't wrong, and Clara knew it. Lying awake that night in the small guest room Otis offered them, staring at the ceiling. Caleb's steady presence in the next room, the only thing keeping her fear from swallowing her whole. The morning of the inquiry dawned clear and cold. The Helena courthouse already crowded with onlookers by the time Caleb helped Clara down from the wagon, her hands ice cold, despite the borrowed gloves, her spine straight, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "You don't have to do this alone," Caleb murmured, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. "I know," she said. "That's the only reason I'm not shaking harder than I already am." Richard Holloway was already seated inside, immaculate as always, flanked by 2 sharp-suited lawyers, a small satisfied smile playing at the corner of his mouth as Clara took her seat across the aisle. "Mrs. Bennett," he said pleasantly, inclining his head, "you look remarkably composed for a woman about to have her secrets aired before the whole county." "I look composed, Mr. Holloway," Clara said evenly, "because I finally have nothing left to hide." His smile flickered just slightly before the judge called the room to order. The inquiry began exactly as badly as Clara feared. Holloway's lead lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Marsh, painted a portrait of a scheming widow, cataloging every rumor from her hometown with theatrical precision. The whispers of poisoning, the convenient timing of Higgins's death, the debts her husband left behind, that a grieving widow might have found awfully motivating to erase through violence. Clara sat through it with her chin lifted, hands folded tight in her lap, and felt every eye in the courtroom weighing her, judging her exactly the way she'd feared they would. "Mrs. Bennett," Marsh said finally, rounding on her, "isn't it true that you quarreled violently with Walter Higgins the very night he died?" The courtroom rustled with sudden interest. Clara's heart pounded, but her voice when it came was steady. "Yes," she said. "That's true." Gasps rippled through the room. Marsh's smile sharpened. "You quarreled with him, and hours later he was dead, and you never told a single soul about that argument for 3 entire years. Doesn't that strike you as the behavior of a guilty woman, Mrs. Bennett?" "No," Clara said. "It strikes me as the behavior of a frightened one. There's a difference, Mr. Marsh, though I imagine a man in your position has rarely had reason to learn it." A few scattered chuckles moved through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "Explain the argument, then," Marsh pressed. "If you're so innocent, what exactly were you and Walter Higgins fighting about that night?" This was the moment. Clara felt Caleb's steady presence behind her in the gallery, felt the folded letter still sewn safely into her dress, and took a breath. I confronted Walter Higgins because I discovered he was embezzling funds from investors, including my own husband, through his brokerage. I found a ledger proving numbers had been altered, money diverted into accounts under his name. When I threatened to bring it to my husband, Walter Higgins grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise it and threatened to destroy my reputation if I said a word. A convenient story, Marsh said smoothly, with no evidence to support it since you claim this ledger no longer exists. I burned the ledger, Clara admitted, and the courtroom erupted again, forcing another sharp crack of the gavel. I burned it because I was a terrified 29-year-old widow who believed foolishly that destroying evidence of his crime would protect my late husband's good name from being dragged through scandal alongside his own. It was a mistake born of grief and fear, not guilt. How convenient that the one piece of evidence supporting your version of events happens to have gone up in smoke. Not all of it, Clara said, and reached into the hidden seam of her dress, drawing out the folded letter, with hands that had finally blessedly stopped shaking. I kept this. A letter from Walter Higgins to a man he addressed only as R.H., written days before he died, discussing a fraud scheme and a job in Montana Territory that would secure his protection once it paid off. The courtroom went utterly silent. "Objection!" Marsh snapped, rising fast. "This is the first any of us are hearing of such a document. There's no authentication." "There is." Caleb's voice rang out from the gallery, and every head turned as he stood. "Your Honor, I request the court hear testimony from Otis Grimwald, formerly of Territorial Trust and Cattle Exchange, who processed the very wire transfers referenced in that letter, and can identify the authorizing signature behind them." The judge, an older man with sharp, weary eyes that had clearly seen every manner of courtroom theater in his time, studied Caleb for a long moment before nodding. "I'll allow it. Mr. Grimwald, if you're present, approach the bench." Otis rose from the back of the gallery, hat in hand, and made his way forward with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who understood exactly the weight of what he was about to do. What followed was 30 of the longest minutes of Clara's life. Otis laying out wire authorizations with careful, methodical precision, identifying Richard Holloway's own signature on transfers flowing into and out of Walter Higgins's brokerage across 2 full years. The courtroom's collective understanding shifting slowly, inexorably from suspicion of the widow toward something far more dangerous, aimed squarely at the man seated smugly across the aisle. Holloway's composure finally began to crack. "This is outrageous," he snapped, half rising from his seat. "A retired clerk with a grudge and a forged letter from a dead man." "The letter isn't forged, Mr. Holloway," Caleb said, standing now too unable to hold his tongue any longer. "Unlike the deed your man Pratt filed on my north pasture, using a signature so carefully copied from my father's real hand that it nearly fooled me too, until I noticed the loop of his C didn't match 20 years of letters I've read 100 times over." The courtroom gasped again, louder this time. "Order!" The judge barked, gavel cracking hard against the bench. "One more outburst from either party, and I'll clear this courtroom entirely." Silence fell tense and electric, and into it the judge turned his sharp eyes toward Richard Holloway. "Mr. Holloway, this inquiry was filed by your legal counsel regarding the death of Walter Higgins. Yet in the course of this hearing, we've uncovered testimony and documentation suggesting financial fraud connecting your own bank to the deceased, as well as a separate, entirely unrelated allegation of forged property deeds on Whitmore land. I find myself wondering whether this inquiry was ever truly about seeking justice for Mr. Higgins's death, or whether it was designed as a weapon against Mrs. Bennett to distract from far more serious crimes potentially committed by your own hand. Your Honor, I assure you, I'm not finished, Mr. Holloway." The judge's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Given the evidence presented today, I am dismissing this inquiry into Mrs. Bennett's conduct entirely. There is no credible evidence of foul play in Walter Higgins's death, only evidence of a woman who made a frightened, understandable decision 3 years ago to protect her husband's memory rather than expose a fraud she had every reason to fear would be used against her." His eyes hardened. "However, given the serious allegations that have surfaced today regarding forged deeds and financial fraud, I am ordering a full territorial investigation into Richard Holloway, his associate, Elias Pratt, and territorial trust and cattle exchange, effective immediately. Sheriff, please ensure Mr. Holloway does not leave Helena until this investigation has run its proper course. The courtroom erupted into noise, reporters scrambling, onlookers murmuring in shocked waves. And Richard Holloway sat frozen in his seat, the smug confidence that had carried him through every scheme of his life, finally completely gone. Clara turned, searching the crowd, and found Caleb already moving toward her. And when he reached her, he didn't say a single word, just pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the chaos. And Clara buried her face against his chest, and finally let herself cry, not from fear this time, but from 3 years of carried weight finally blessedly lifting free. "It's over," Caleb murmured into her hair. "Clara, it's over. He's going to fight it," she said, muffled against his coat. "Men like him always fight." "Let him fight," Caleb said. "He'll be fighting a territorial investigation with a paper trail leading straight to his own signature, not a frightened widow with nothing but rumor stacked against her. That's a very different war, and it's not one he's going to win." Behind them, Richard Holloway rose slowly from his seat, straightened his immaculate coat with hands that weren't quite steady, and for one brief moment his eyes met Clara's across the chaos of the courtroom. There was no more mockery in them, no more cold amusement, just the flat, furious stare of a man who understood finally that he'd lost. "This isn't finished, Whitmore," he said low enough that only those nearest could hear. "It is for you," Caleb said, not even bothering to turn fully toward him. "The only thing left to finish is however many years a judge decides you owe the territory for forgery and fraud." Holloway's jaw tightened, but the sheriff was already moving toward him, and whatever retort he might have made died in his throat as he was escorted from the courtroom, the crowd parting around him like he carried something contagious. Clara watched him go, waiting for triumph to settle over her, and instead found something quieter, something closer to peace than she'd felt in 3 long years. "He can't hurt you anymore," Caleb said softly, watching her face. "I know," she said. "I think that's why I don't quite know what to feel yet." "You'll figure it out," Caleb said, tucking her hand back into the crook of his arm. "You've got the rest of your life to figure it out if you're willing to spend it figuring it out with me." Something in Clara's chest cracked open, warm and terrified, and impossibly hopeful all at once. "Caleb Whitmore, is that your idea of a proposal?" "It's my idea of a promise," he said, a real smile breaking across his face for the first time in what felt like days. "The proposal comes later, once we're home, once I've done it properly, instead of in the middle of a crowded courthouse with half of Helena still staring at us." Clara laughed a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the sound turning heads even amid the lingering chaos of the courtroom. "I'll hold you to that. I'm counting on it." They rode back toward the Whitmore Ranch 3 days later, the territorial investigation into Holloway already gathering momentum behind them. Otis Grimwald's testimony, joined by 3 more former Territorial Trust employees who'd suddenly found their courage. Once the first domino fell, each one adding another brick to the wall, closing in around Richard Holloway's carefully built empire. The ranch looked different when they rode into the yard this time, not because anything had physically changed, but because Clara saw it now with different eyes that no longer measured the distance to the nearest exit, eyes that had stopped somewhere in the last 3 weeks, calculating how quickly she might need to leave. Jeb met them at the gate, grinning wide enough to nearly split his weathered face in 2. "Word's already reached town," he said. "Whole county's talking about how Holloway's scheme came crashing down in that courtroom. Mrs. Bennett, I don't believe there's a soul left in 3 counties still whispering ugly things about you. Matter of fact, I heard the mercantile owner's wife telling anybody who'd listen that she always knew you were a decent woman." "Is that so?" Clara said dryly, though warmth spread through her chest regardless. "Funny how quick folks change their tune once the truth gets louder than the lie," Jeb said, and clapped Caleb hard on the shoulder. "Good work, boss. Your daddy would have been proud watching you stand up in that courtroom the way you did." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Grief and pride, tangled together the way they always seemed to be whenever his father came up. But he nodded steady, and for the first time, Clara saw him carry that grief without letting it swallow him whole. That evening supper stretched longer than usual. The whole ranch gathered around the long table, voices loud and warm. Tom retelling the courtroom scene with increasingly dramatic flourishes, despite not having been anywhere near Helena, until the whole table was laughing so hard, Clara had to wipe tears from her eyes that had nothing to do with grief at all. Later, once the dishes were cleared and the hands had drifted off toward the bunkhouse, Caleb found her on the porch, staring out at the pasture, bathed silver and moonlight cattle, grazing peaceful and undisturbed for the first time in weeks. "I owe you an apology," he said, settling beside her on the porch step. "For what? You didn't do anything wrong. For the very first night you arrived," he said. "I looked at you standing there with your suitcase and your sharp tongue, and I judged you before I gave you the chance to prove me wrong. I told you that you didn't look like someone who could survive out here." "I remember. I was wrong," Caleb said. "You didn't just survive out here, Clara. You walked into a house full of grief and silence, and you didn't just cook meals in it. You rebuilt it one supper, one kind word, one stubborn refusal to let me hide from my own life at a time. You did that while carrying more weight than I ever understood, and you never once let it break you." Clara's throat tightened. "You repaired something in this ranch that I thought was gone for good," Caleb continued, voice rough with feeling. "But it wasn't just the ranch, was it? It was me. You repaired me." "I didn't repair you, Caleb," Clara said softly, echoing words that felt like they'd been waiting inside her for weeks to be spoken. "I just reminded you that you were never broken. You were only waiting for someone to remind you it was safe to stop surviving and start living again." Caleb reached for her hand, and this time beneath the wide Montana sky, with the danger finally behind them, and the whole ranch settling into peaceful sleep. Around them, he didn't hesitate. "Marry me, Clara Bennett," he said. "Not because a courthouse cleared your name, and not because a ranch needs a cook. Marry me because somewhere between that first night on my porch steps and this one, you became the reason I look forward to waking up every single morning. Marry me because I love you plainly and completely, and I don't intend to spend one more day pretending otherwise." Clara looked at him, this proud, grieving, steady man who'd stood in a courtroom and defended her before the whole county, who'd learned to laugh again at his own supper table, who'd chosen her over land and legacy, and every safe, careful wall he'd built around his heart for 5 long years, and felt the last of her own careful walls come tumbling down right alongside his. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and certain, carrying none of the fear that had followed her across 200 miles of hard road. "Yes, Caleb, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, slow and certain, beneath a sky scattered with more stars than either of them could ever hope to count. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the porch, an owl called out low and steady, as if even the land itself understood that something broken had finally truly been made whole again. The ranch that had stood silent and grieving for 5 long years no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt for the first time since Sarah Whitmore's death like a home. Morning broke soft and gold over the Whitmore ranch, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Whitmore woke without that familiar hollow ache pressing against his ribs before his eyes even opened, even tuned. He found Clara already in the kitchen, humming something low and tuneless under her breath, sunlight catching the loose strands of hair she hadn't yet pinned back, and he stood in the doorway a long moment just watching her. Still half convinced, the whole thing might be a dream he'd wake from. "You're staring," she said without turning around. "I'm allowed to stare at my future wife." "Future wife's got biscuits to get in the oven before they burn, so unless you intend to help." He crossed the kitchen and kissed the side of her head instead, and she swatted at him with a flour-dusted hand, laughing, and the sound of it filled the whole house, the way sunlight fills a room that's finally had its curtains thrown open after years shut tight. The peace didn't last past breakfast. A rider came hard into the yard just as the hands were finishing their coffee, and Jeb met him at the gate, exchanging low words that made his weathered face go tight before he came striding toward the porch. "Boss, you're gonna want to hear this yourself." Caleb met him halfway across the yard, Clara close behind, wiping her hands on her apron, dread already coiling low in her stomach at the look on Jeb's face. "It's Pratt," Jeb said. "Elias Pratt. He's turned himself in to the territorial marshal in Helena Boss. Says he wants to make a full confession in exchange for leniency on account of everything that's coming out about Holloway in the investigation." "A confession to what?" Clara asked, voice tight. Jeb hesitated, glancing between the two of them. "Says he's got proof. Holloway didn't just forge the deed on the North Pasture. Says he's willing to testify. Holloway ordered a man to run Walter Higgins' horse off that ridge trail 3 years back. Says it wasn't an accident at all, ma'am. Says Higgins was about to turn state's evidence against Holloway's whole operation before the fraud collapsed, and Holloway couldn't let that happen." The yard tilted beneath Clara's feet. 3 years. 3 years she'd carried the guilt of a quarrel she believed might have somehow contributed to a man's death. 3 years of silent private shame. And now, standing in the morning light with her whole life finally beginning to open up in front of her, she learned the truth had never been an accident at all. It had been murder. Ordered from a desk 200 miles away by a man who'd nearly destroyed her a second time just to protect land he'd wanted for 40 years. "He murdered him," she whispered. "Walter Higgins didn't die because his horse threw him on a bad trail. Richard Holloway had him killed." "That's what Pratt's claiming," Jeb said carefully. "Marshall wants Pratt's testimony corroborated before anything's official. But boss ma'am, if it holds up, this ain't just fraud and forged deeds anymore. This is a hanging offense." Caleb's arm came around Clara's shoulders, steady grounding her as the ground threatened to give way beneath the weight of it. 3 years, she said again, quieter, now tears rising unbidden. "I blamed myself for 3 years. I thought maybe if I hadn't confronted him, maybe if I'd just stayed silent." "You didn't kill anyone, Clara." Caleb turned her gently to face him, hands framing her face the way they had that first storm-lit night in the kitchen. "You confronted a thief who was stealing from your own husband, and a far more dangerous man decided that thief had become inconvenient. None of that blood is on your hands. It never was." "I know that," she said, voice breaking. "I know it here." She pressed a hand to her heart. "But I've spent 3 years believing something else in here too, and it's going to take longer than one morning to let it go." "Then I'll remind you every single morning for as long as it takes," Caleb said simply. And something in the quiet certainty of his voice loosened the knot that had lived in Clara's chest for 3 long years, just slightly, just enough to breathe a little easier. The investigation moved fast after that. Pratt's confession corroborated over the following days by 2 more witnesses. A stable hand, who'd been paid to leave a saddle strap deliberately worn thin, and a saloon keeper who'd overheard Holloway's man boasting drunk about a job well done, landed like an avalanche across the territory. What had begun as a land dispute over a single North Pasture unraveled into a criminal enterprise spanning a decade, stretching across 3 counties, built on forged signatures, engineered fraud, and now murder. Richard Holloway was arrested formally 8 days after the courthouse inquiry, dragged from the very hotel suite in Helena, where he'd been quietly making arrangements to flee east, his lawyer's assurances of victory replaced overnight by the cold reality of iron bars. Word reached the ranch by Ryder on a bright, blustery afternoon, and Clara stood on the porch reading the telegram twice through before she could quite believe it. "He's not getting out," she said half to herself. "Caleb, he's not getting out of this." Caleb read over her shoulder, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke the weight of 3 years of Clara's and of Caleb's own 5 years of grief tangled up in the fight to protect what remained of both their families, finally fully lifting. "It's over," Caleb said again, the words carrying more certainty this time than they had in the courthouse chaos. "Truly over, Clara. No more rumors, no more forged papers, no more threats riding into this yard in the dead of night." Clara let out a breath that shook on its way out, relief and grief, and something like disbelief all tangled together. "I don't know what to do with myself," she admitted. "I've spent 3 years bracing for the next blow. I don't know how to just stop bracing." "You start," Caleb said. taking the telegram gently from her hands and folding it away. By planning a wedding instead of a defense. That seems like a fair trade to me. Despite everything, Clara laughed real and bright, the sound carrying clear across the yard, and Tom, passing by with an armful of feed, grinned so wide it looked like it might split his face clean in two. The weeks that followed passed in a warmth Clara hadn't allowed herself to imagine in 3 long years. The town that had once whispered about the cursed widow now could not do enough to welcome her. The mercantile owner's wife, who'd once refused to sell her flour, showed up at the ranch unannounced with a bolt of pale blue fabric. "For the wedding dress, if you'll have it. Mrs. Bennet and I do hope you'll forgive an old woman for believing gossip over good sense." Reverend Collins rode out personally to apologize for ever entertaining the notion of canceling the church social, and stayed for supper, laughing louder than anyone at Tom's increasingly elaborate retellings of the courthouse showdown. Clara found herself more than once standing in the middle of the kitchen with tears in her eyes, for reasons that had nothing to do with grief at all, simply overwhelmed by the strange, dizzying gift of being welcomed somewhere fully after so long spent merely tolerated. "You all right?" Caleb asked one evening, finding her like that wooden spoon forgotten in her hand, staring at nothing. "I keep waiting for the other boot to drop," she admitted. 3 years of watching every kindness turn into another door closing in my face. It's strange learning to trust that this—" She gestured vaguely at the warm kitchen, the sound of hands laughing in the next room, the ring newly settled on her finger. "That this is just allowed to be real, that nobody's going to snatch it away." "Nobody's snatching anything away," Caleb said, pulling her gently against his chest. "Holloway's rotting in a Helena jail cell awaiting trial for murder. Pratt's testifying against him in exchange for his own leniency. The whole territory knows your name now, Clara, and they know it as the woman who stood up in a courtroom and told the truth even when it cost her everything to do it. That's the only reputation that's going to follow you from here forward." "I love you," Clara said, suddenly fiercely, like the words had been building pressure behind her ribs and simply needed release. "I don't think I've said it plainly enough these past weeks, with everything else crowding in. I love you, Caleb Whitmore, and I am so unbelievably grateful your advertisement was the one door that opened when I needed it most." "I love you too," Caleb said, voice rough with feeling. "And for what it's worth, I've been grateful every single day since you told me I hadn't slept in 5 years. Rudest, truest thing anybody said to me in a decade, and it's the reason I fell for you before supper was even finished cooking." She laughed against his chest, and outside the kitchen window, the last light of the day spilled gold and warm across a ranch that had finally, after 5 long years, remembered what it felt like to hold happiness inside its walls instead of grief. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of autumn, when the Montana heat finally broke and the cottonwoods along the creek began turning the color of old gold coins. Preparations consumed the ranch in the best possible way, Jeb overseeing the construction of long tables to be set up in the yard. Tom practicing a fiddle he'd apparently been hiding talent for all along, and Clara spending her evenings with the mercantile owner's wife and 2 other women from town, stitching the pale blue dress by lamplight, laughing over stories and secrets the way women do when true friendship finally has room to take root. "You've changed this whole ranch," the mercantile owner's wife told her one evening, needle pausing mid-stitch. "I don't just mean the flowers by the porch or the way the hands sing now while they work. I mean Caleb Whitmore himself. I've known that boy since he was knee-high, watched him bury his mother, then his father, then his wife, one right after another, until I genuinely feared he'd bury himself alongside all of them. Eventually, just standing there quiet enough nobody would notice he'd stopped living too. You brought him back, Clara. Whatever else happens in this life, you ought to know that." Clara's throat tightened around unexpected tears. "He brought himself back," she said softly. "I just made sure he had a reason to try." "Sometimes," the older woman said, resuming her stitching with a knowing smile, "that's the very same thing." 3 days before the wedding, a final piece of news arrived that closed the last open wound of the whole ordeal. Richard Holloway's trial concluded swiftly once Pratt's testimony was joined by hard financial records. Otis Grimwald had painstakingly assembled alongside sworn statements from two of Holloway's own hired men, who'd finally found the courage to speak once they understood their boss's empire had finally collapsed. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. The sentence was severe enough that Richard Holloway would spend the remainder of his days behind bars, his family's fortunes seized to compensate the families he'd ruined across 3 counties. His name transformed overnight, from one whispered with fear into one spoken only with contempt. Clara read the telegram on the porch steps, Caleb beside her, and felt something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't realized was still unsettled, a final quiet closing of a door that had haunted her for 3 long years. Walter Higgins wasn't a good man, she said slowly. He stole from people who trusted him. He threatened me the night he died. But he didn't deserve to be murdered for trying to protect himself once the scheme he was trapped in collapsed around him. And I didn't deserve to carry 3 years of guilt over a death I had nothing to do with. No, Caleb agreed quietly. You didn't. I think, Clara said, folding the telegram carefully and setting it aside. I'm finally ready to stop carrying it. Good, Caleb said, taking her hand. Because in 3 days, I intend to marry a woman who spent quite enough of her life bracing for the next blow. I'd like the rest of her days to feel a great deal lighter than that, if she'll let me help carry whatever's left. Clara turned to him, heart full nearly to bursting. I think, she said, that's precisely what I intend to let you do, Caleb Whitmore, for the rest of both our lives. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and impossibly blue, the kind of Montana sky that seemed to stretch on forever without a single cloud to interrupt it. Clara stood in the small room off the pantry, the very room she'd first slept in as a stranger, with nothing but a suitcase and a battered recipe book, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror the mercantile owner's wife had insisted on bringing out for the occasion. The pale blue dress fit like it had been made for exactly this moment, and in a way it had. You look like your mother, came a voice from the doorway. And Clara turned to find Jeb standing there, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically soft around the eyes. I mean that is the highest compliment an old ranch hand knows how to give, ma'am. There's a photograph your recipe book fell open to once weeks back when you first got here. Woman in it had the same look about her you've got right now. Jeb Caro, are you getting sentimental on me? Absolutely not, he said gruffly, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. Just came to say the boss is out there pacing a groove in the yard, and if you don't hurry up and marry him soon, I fear he might wear a permanent trench into good grazing land. Clara laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, and let Jeb walk her out through the kitchen. The same kitchen where she'd first stood defiant against a grieving stranger, where she'd cooked her way into the hearts of 12 hardened ranch hands, where she'd fallen in love without ever quite meaning to. The yard beyond had transformed entirely. Long tables draped in white cloth stretched beneath the cottonwoods. Gold leaves drifting down occasionally to settle among the wildflowers Clara herself had planted weeks before, back when the ranch was still learning how to breathe again. The whole town had turned out the very same town that had once threatened to cancel a church social rather than be seen near her, now filling every available chair, faces bright with genuine warmth instead of suspicion. And there, standing beneath an arch of late-season roses, the hands had built with far more enthusiasm than skill, stood Caleb Whitmore dressed in his finest coat, looking for all the world like a man who'd forgotten how to stand still. Their eyes met across the yard, and every ounce of nervous energy seemed to drain right out of him at once, replaced by something so raw and open and grateful that Clara felt her own eyes sting with unexpected tears before she'd even taken her first step down the aisle. Reverend Collins cleared his throat as she approached, smiling warm despite his own earlier hesitations, and began the ceremony with words Clara barely heard over the sound of her own heart pounding, aware of nothing in the whole wide Montana sky except the steady, certain gaze of the man waiting for her. Caleb Whitmore, Reverend Collins said. Do you take this woman? I do, Caleb said before the Reverend had even finished the question, drawing startled laughter from the gathered crowd. Son, I hadn't finished asking. With respect, Reverend, I've been ready to say those two words since the second week she cooked in my kitchen. I'd rather not wait a moment longer than necessary." More laughter rippled through the yard, and Clara felt her whole face ache from smiling tears slipping free, despite her best efforts to hold them back. "And Clara Bennett," the Reverend continued, turning to her with a warm, knowing smile. "Do you take this man?" "I do," Clara said just as quickly, and the yard erupted into laughter and applause before Reverend Collins could even attempt to finish his own sentence a second time. "Well," the old Reverend said, shaking his head with fond exasperation, "I suppose that settles that. By the power vested in me, and given how thoroughly you've both already answered the question, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Caleb didn't wait for permission to kiss her. He pulled Clara into his arms right there beneath the rose arch, and the whole yard erupted into cheers, loud enough to send the cattle in the distant pasture, lifting their heads in mild alarm. Tom's fiddle, striking up something bright and joyful, before the kiss had even properly ended. Later, as the sun began its slow slide toward the western ridge painting, the whole ranch gold and amber, Clara found herself standing near the edge of the celebration, watching the hands dance clumsily with the town's daughters, watching Jeb attempt an enthusiastic reel that had absolutely no business being attempted by a man his age, watching the whole ranch alive with laughter and music and warmth in a way it hadn't been in longer than anyone could properly remember. Caleb found her there, slipping an arm around her waist, following her gaze out over the celebration. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" he murmured. "It's everything," Clara said softly. "Everything I stopped letting myself hope for 3 years ago, standing in a room folding my husband's shirts into a trunk I never planned to open again." "You kept one shirt," Caleb said gently. He'd learned that detail from her weeks ago, one quiet evening when she'd finally told him everything about the life she'd left behind. "The blue one." "I did." "Do you still have it?" "I do. Packed away careful, same as always." Clara turned to look up at him, something peaceful settling behind her eyes. "I'm not ashamed of loving him once, Caleb. He was a good man who made a foolish mistake trusting the wrong person, and I loved him the way anyone loves a first love fully, and without knowing yet how much the world could ask of a person afterward." "I'd never ask you to be ashamed of that," Caleb said. "Loving someone new doesn't erase the person you lost. I learned that lesson myself these past months, thinking of Sarah every single day, even while falling entirely hopelessly in love with you. It doesn't dishonor what came before Clara. If anything, it honors, it proves the love was real enough to teach us both how to love again, rather than closing that door forever." Clara's eyes filled, but she was smiling wide and unguarded, the kind of smile she hadn't allowed herself in 3 long years. "When did you get so wise, Caleb Whitmore?" "Somewhere around the 2nd week," he said, "when a stubborn widow with a sharp tongue and a battered recipe book walked up my porch steps and refused to let me hide from my own life any longer." The music shifted into something slower, and Caleb drew her out among the dancing couples, holding her close beneath a sky just beginning to blush with the first stars of evening, the whole ranch glowing warm and gold around them. "I have something to tell you," Clara said softly. Midway through the dance, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement Caleb hadn't heard from her before. "What is it?" She hesitated, then took his hand and pressed it gently against her stomach, watching his face carefully as understanding slowly dawned behind his stormy eyes. "Clara." His voice cracked around her name. "I wasn't entirely certain until this week," she said, tears rising fast, now happy ones, this time unmistakably. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, especially not with everything else we were facing. But Caleb, I think by spring this ranch is going to need a nursery." For a moment, Caleb Whitmore, the richest and once loneliest man in 3 counties, simply stood frozen in the middle of his own wedding celebration, staring at his wife with an expression of such raw, overwhelming joy that Clara felt her own heart nearly burst from the sight of it. Then he laughed full and unguarded, the sound rolling out across the yard, drawing curious, delighted glances from the gathered guests, and swept her up into his arms, spinning her once, despite her surprised protest, before setting her down gently, and kissing her again, slower this time, full of everything neither of them had words enough to say. "A baby," he said, voice thick with wonder. "Clara, we're going to have a baby." "We are," she confirmed, laughing through her own tears now. "I thought I'd already been given more happiness this year than one man deserves," Caleb said, resting his forehead against hers. "I stand corrected." Jeb, catching sight of the commotion from across the yard, came hurrying over with Tom close behind both of them, grinning wide at whatever news had put that particular look on the boss's face. "Well," Jeb demanded, "you gonna share with the rest of us or keep grinning like a fool in private?" Caleb looked at Clara, silently asking permission, and when she nodded, he turned back to the small crowd already gathering, curious and warm-hearted, drawn in by the obvious joy radiating off the newly married couple. "Come spring," Caleb announced, voice carrying clear across the whole celebration. "This ranch is going to have a new Whitmore running around it." The yard erupted into cheers louder than any that had come before Tom, nearly dropping his fiddle in his excitement. Jeb, whooping loud enough to startle the horses in the distant corral. The mercantile owner's wife already dabbing at happy tears with her handkerchief. And Reverend Collins offering up a blessing so heartfelt it drew its own round of applause once he'd finished. Clara stood in the middle of it all. This ranch that had once felt like a monument to grief, now filled to bursting with laughter and music, and the promise of a new life beginning inside her. And thought of the woman she'd been 3 weeks into this journey, terrified and alone, and certain the whole world had already decided who she was before she'd had the chance to prove otherwise. That woman could never have imagined this. Not the courtroom victory, not the town's transformed welcome, not the ring on her finger or the life growing beneath her heart. Not the steady, unshakable love of a man who'd once told her she didn't look like someone who could survive out here, only to spend every day since proving he'd never once truly believed that himself. As the celebration stretched into evening, lanterns lit one by one across the yard, Clara found a quiet moment to slip away toward the porch, needing just a breath of stillness amid so much joyful noise. Caleb found her there minutes later, settling beside her on the very steps where they'd first stood as strangers, suspicious and guarded, 3 months and an entire lifetime ago. "Regretting the noise already?" he teased gently. "Never," Clara said, leaning into him. "Just remembering." "Remembering what?" "The first thing you ever said to me, standing right here on these very steps." She smiled, soft and fond. "You don't look like someone who can handle this place." Caleb winced, laughing despite himself. "I was an idiot." "You were grieving," Clara corrected gently. "And scared, though you'd never have admitted it then." "I understood that better than you knew because I was carrying the very same fear, just dressed up different." She turned to look at him fully, eyes bright with everything she'd found on this ranch that she'd never expected to find again. "Neither of us looked like people who could survive what we'd been through, Caleb, but we did. Together, somehow we did." Caleb reached over, taking her hand, threading his fingers through hers, the way he had every night since that storm-lit evening in the kitchen when everything between them had first begun to shift. "My father used to say a ranch isn't built by the size of its land," he said quietly, "but by the strength of the people willing to stand on it together through whatever storms come." He looked out over the yard at the hands still dancing at Jeb, attempting yet another reel with far more enthusiasm than grace, at the whole ranch glowing warm beneath a sky full of stars. "I used to think I understood what that meant. I didn't. Not really. Not until you." Clara rested her head against his shoulder, watching the celebration continue, without them for just a little while longer, content simply to sit in the quiet certainty of everything they'd built from the wreckage of what they'd both once lost. "Do you ever wonder?" she asked softly. "What might have happened if I'd never answered that advertisement? If I'd stayed in that town, buried under all those whispers, and never found the courage to leave?" "In jail, I try not to," Caleb admitted. "It's the one thought that still frightens me more than Holloway ever did." "I almost didn't come," Clara confessed. "Did I ever tell you that I stood at that crossroads with the stagecoach driver telling me the whole place was cursed, And for one long moment, I nearly turned around and went right back the way I came. What stopped you? Clara considered the question, turning it over slowly, watching the lantern light flicker gold across the yard, where her whole new life continued celebrating without her. I thought about my mother's recipe book, she said finally. The very first page. Feed people well, and you feed their courage too. I'd spent 3 years forgetting I had any courage left to feed. Standing at that crossroads, I decided the only way to find out was to keep walking forward instead of running back toward everything familiar and safe and empty. She smiled up at him, eyes glistening. I suppose I owe my mother's recipe book more credit than I've ever given it. Remind me to thank it properly, Caleb said. Right after I thank whatever stubborn, reckless courage made you knock on my door instead of turning that stagecoach right back around. That courage, Clara said, had a name. Still does. And what's that? She looked at him steady and certain, the woman who'd walked 2 miles down a dusty road with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, who'd stood on a stranger's porch and refused to be intimidated. Who'd rebuilt a house and a man's shattered spirit, one honest meal and one honest word at a time, who'd faced down rumor and forgery and murder itself, rather than run from a love she'd never expected to find twice in one lifetime. Hope, Clara said simply. Even when I didn't believe I had any left, some stubborn piece of me kept it burning anyway. I think that's the only thing strong enough to survive everything we've both been through, Caleb. Not luck, not money, not even love, not entirely on its own. Just hope, stubborn and quiet, refusing to give up even when everything else says it should. Caleb pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, and out beyond the porch, the celebration rolled on beneath a sky ablaze with stars, the whole Whitmore ranch alive with music and laughter and the unmistakable warmth of a home finally fully restored. Years later, when neighbors told the story of Caleb Whitmore and Clara Bennett to their own children on quiet evenings, they didn't dwell on the forged deeds or the courtroom drama or even the wealth that had once made Caleb's name known across 3 counties. They remembered the widow who arrived with nothing but a suitcase and refused to be afraid. They remembered the cowboy who learned that love wasn't a weakness waiting to be punished twice, but a strength waiting patiently to be trusted again. They remembered a kitchen that had stood cold and silent for 5 long years, brought back to life by nothing more than good food, honest words, and a stubborn refusal to let grief have the final say. And most of all, they remembered the truth Clara Bennett carried with her from that very first night, spoken plain on a porch to a broken man who never expected to be